I want to talk about this map today because I think what happened on Tuesday, like so many other people who have been talking about this, is going to fundamentally reshape not only the political landscape in the United States, but frankly could undermine a lot of protections, federally speaking, that the rest of us have in the Constitution. So even if you don't live in New York City, even if you don't care that Zohran Mamdani got elected, this could adversely affect you in the long run. So to begin, I kind of want to do a bit of a primer on the different types of economic systems and how those systems map into political action, because I think a lot of people have been talking about Zohran Mamdani being a communist and a socialist, and I don't think people really understand quite what that means. I mean, these are all terms people talk about and they use, and I think a lot of the people who voted for Zohran Mamdani at the surface, because they're not educated on these things and they're unaware of what they voted for, they think, oh, it's good. Rent freeze is good. City-run grocery stores, great. Free buses, awesome. Like, they only see the free stuff they're getting at the surface level and they think it's good. But what this actually means, if these things are implemented, it will completely erode private property protections here in the United States for the rest of us. And if it happens in a city like New York, it's going to permeate up through the rest of our political systems at the state and at the federal level, because what Zohran Mamdani represents isn't just the election of the new mayor of New York. It represents a fundamental shift in the Democratic Party and where it's going forward. So let's just do a very brief primer. So first, I want to just give you a quick background on feudalism, because that is where all of this stems from. So under feudalism, you produce X for the feudal lord at the manor you are on. So Europe was distributed between all these different manors. Countries really didn't exist yet. There were monarchs and they claimed territory, but usually how it worked is you, the peasant, worked the land of a manor that you lived on. That manor was managed by a feudal lord, and the feudal lord paid taxes and pledged military fealty to the monarch. And so it was very hierarchical, and that's how things work. So you worked the farm, you worked the fields, you produced X, and you paid X to the feudal to the feudal lord, and you would get to keep enough for your subsistence, so enough for your survival, because this was an agrarian-based economy, and you, the worker, were the labor. So you needed enough compensation in terms of grain, in terms of food, in order to keep yourself alive. So compensation during this period of time was caloric in nature. But other than that, there was no surplus. You weren't like collecting anything. You weren't creating extra, holding on to it, and then investing in the future. It was all about the present. It was all about survival. Okay. Then came capitalism. Okay. And capitalism was a fundamental shift in how everything was organized, right? So under capitalism, you produce X, you sell it for Y, and you, as the producer, get to keep Z. So this represented the first time in history where there was effectively a delta between what you produced and what you sold it for on the open market. And during this period of time, the transition out of feudalism into capitalism, the economy slowly changed from one that was primarily about agricultural production to one that was about trading manufactured goods. And obviously, as the Industrial Revolution kicked off, this allowed for mass production of industrial goods. So you no longer were confined to working on some lord's manor and farming their land. You could go work in a factory and you could produce things and you could sell those things at a profit. And so that's what Z represents: profit. For the first time in human history, you, an average Joe Schmo, could earn more than you needed to survive and invest it in the future. And when we think of investing, we think of it like in the current context, like purchasing stocks on the stock market, putting it your savings into a 401k. But what I'm talking about here is by holding on to your surplus, so by having this, you could then go acquire capital for yourself. So it wasn't just you went to a job, you earned an income, and then whatever you didn't spend from that income, you put into your 401k. It was you earned a surplus that over time you could accrue, and then you could go buy your own factory, okay? And you could go start producing things. And if you did a good job at that, you could build another factory and another factory. And that's how we got, the robber barons here in the United States of the 19th and early 20th century, is you had people who effectively played this game. It's kind of like Monopoly. If you haven't played Monopoly in a really long time, go play it, because that is basically capitalism in a nutshell. It means you aren't just allowed to hold the surplus of what you produce. You are allowed to convert that surplus into capital, into things that can then go on and produce even more. And you're permitted under this system to exponentially grow from whatever you started with. So if you started with, a $50 in your bank account and some silk fabric, like, you in the course of your lifetime could become a massive industrial factory owner. Like, that's what capitalism is, okay? So at some point in time, in the, I would say the early 1800s, you had people starting to recognize that Z here wasn't equal. So some people were producing X, selling for Y, and they were getting Z, big Z. Some people were selling for X, or producing X, selling for Y, and they were getting little z. So there was an inequality in the profits that people were getting. And this makes sense. Like, different things have different value. Different things have different prices, right? Like, just think of like shopping, right? Like, compare a store like Old Navy to J. Crew. Like, yes, all else being equal, like, the fabric is pretty much the same. It's produced the same, but it's marketed in such a way where Old Navy is far cheaper than J. Crew. So the profit margins you're going to get on those two pieces of clothing are going to be far different. So J. Crew is going to be up here with the big Z's. Old Navy, they're going to have smaller profits. They're going to be here. So there were a group of people in the 1800s called utopian socialists, and they were like, nah, we don't like this. There's too much inequality. At the time, I think Europe in particular, specifically Britain, just was going through growing pains. There was a large growth in the population. People were finding themselves living in cities. So the housing conditions weren't great. There wasn't sanitation and good healthcare and good water and all that kind of stuff. So you just had a lot of suffering, people not doing good. So you had academics and elite folks who saw this and were like, okay, capitalism it is too greedy. People have gone off the rails. Like, we need to nip this in the bud. So socialism said, we're going to take, let me change color here so you can see this. We're going to take big Z and we're going to give it to little z, and we're going to equal things out. So we're going to redistribute wealth and make it easier for the people earning little z to compete with the people making big Z, okay? So eventually, people tried that. There were a bunch of different utopian socialist communities that were founded. There was one founded here in the United States called New Harmony. That was one of the first ones. And so they tried, and they didn't work. They didn't work. I'll get into why in just a minute. So eventually, much of the 1800s was a period of struggle in Europe. And if you're like me, you grew up in the United States, you learn American history, you don't really get that in history classes, right? Like, I think we think of history in the United States like the war, the Revolutionary War period, the founding of the country, then it like skips to the revolution. There's this whole period of time in between where the United States is still trying to figure itself out, is still trying to grow, has a very different trajectory than the rest of Europe. So while London is being crowded with poor urban tenements and people struggling and slaving away for 16 hours a day for next to nothing in factories, like here in the United States, we had a very different trajectory. So this is like important because we kind of skipped over this in our history. So they tried socialism in Europe. Socialism didn't work. The 1800s were a very turbulent period of time. You had Napoleon's wars. You had the revolutions in 1848. And during this period of time as well, largely as an outgrowth of capitalism and of the Industrial Revolution, you had a transition from like monarchical rule and and countries that were governed, or areas that were governed by monarchs, to state rule, where suddenly you had territories that were states. So before, this period of time, you have the Kingdom of Prussia. Then, in the late 1800s, you had the unification of Germany, and Germany became a state. It became a nation, and people identified as Germans. So Europe was going through a lot of growing pains during this period of time. So socialism didn't work. So you had a fellow named Karl Marx, and he came up, or no, not capitalism, sorry, communism. You had Karl Marx. He wrote a couple treatises, and he was like, no, we have to violently overthrow. So we can't do this. We can't do this and just ask for people to participate communally in a system and redistribute wealth. There are people who are producing X, they are selling it for Y, they are getting Z, they're getting big Z, and those people are stealing the labor off of all of the workers in these factories, all these little workers in the factories. So it's incumbent on these people here to rise up and take big Z here, okay? And so that is essentially communism in a nutshell, as originally envisioned by Karl Marx, that the proletariat, the peasant class, the working class, they would rise up against the owners of capital, and they would take what is rightfully theirs, okay? So within these four systems of economics and governance, you had complementary political and government systems that emerged to enforce the rules of this game. So under feudalism, there was no private property ownership. Okay, you didn't own anything. You worked on someone else's land. You grazed your sheep or your cattle or whatever on communally held land. Everything was done at the permission and the behest of the feudal lord that you served. There was no private property rights. So because there was no private property rights, this is what I would call like a strong man form of government. So you as the lord, or you as the monarch, were in charge of enforcing the rule of law. And the rule of law wasn't necessarily codified in a constitution like we are accustomed to today, although that did evolve over time. Initially, it was, okay, here's what I think. These are my rules. I'm in charge. This is my property. Therefore, here's what you're going to go do. And so that's how things worked under feudalism. So if you worked under and you lived on the manor of a benevolent lord and a benevolent king, like, you had a good life. If you lived on a manor where you were exploited and the king was a tyrant, you had a difficult life. And that is that's kind of how the things worked. And so under this period of time, the strongmen were also elites. So they were the ones who had the money, right? So because you couldn't accrue anything here, you weren't like deriving a profit, you couldn't build wealth for yourself. Like, there was no socioeconomic ladder for you to climb to get yourself out of the status you were in. You were a peasant. That is what you were always going to be. And the people who had money, they ran things, right? Because they had the means to do so. They could buy off their enemies. They could have their enemies killed. They could command armies, all that kind of stuff, okay? Capitalism changes this because capitalism introduces private property, okay? So it wasn't just the first time in history where you could generate a surplus, a profit from your labor, from your productive capabilities. That was also considered private property, okay? And so the entire Constitution of the United States, you could argue that the United States is a country that was founded out of capitalism. I mean, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was published in 1776 when the American Revolution kicked off. And just because he published that book in 1776 doesn't mean that's when capitalism officially kicked off. It had started before that. He was just the first person to put pen to paper to explain what was happening, right? So the United States was the first country to implement its own system of government based on private property ownership. So the entirety of our Constitution is predicated on this right here. Your ability and my ability to own property, so own a home, own land, own our cars, whatever, own it, and then also defend it, because that's also the Second Amendment, right? So we have the ability to own property, and then we have the ability to defend it. And of course, you know, it's not necessarily just a free-for-all. Like, we pay taxes, we pay into the system. Part of the role of government, as it was originally intended, was to provide the protective benefits that you need to ensure that a capitalist society runs. So, for example, like as the United States grew westward, you often saw military outposts out west, where you also had fur traders and trappers and pioneers and gold diggers and all that kind of stuff, right? Because you had to have an armed military presence to combat the threats that were coming from Native American tribes in the West, right? And this also happened when Europe colonized Africa as well. You often saw a government presence in terms of providing collective protection in order to ensure industry and capital was able to grow and flourish. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. So we pay taxes, like, yes, we own private property, but we pay taxes, we pay into the government in order to provide that protection to us, okay? So we went from not owning private property to suddenly being able to own private property, but because there was a discrepancy in how private property was distributed, the socialists said, okay, we can have property, but it's going to be communal property, okay? So people who lived in utopian socialist communes, that's what they did. They pooled their resources together. So suddenly you're not just working for your own benefit. You're not working to build wealth for yourself. You are working, and whatever your Z is, whatever the Z is here, you're putting into this pot. You're putting into the pot for the community. And then the community is going to vote and decide on how it's going to be used, whether you're going to build roads with it, infrastructure, invest, like they're going to decide, right? And I think at a local level, this can work. You need to have rules in place. And part of the problem with utopian socialists is the utopianism. The fact that a lot of socialists are so obsessed with making sure everyone has a voice that in doing so, nothing actually gets done. You can't please everyone, right? So like, you need rules, you need rule of law, you need a paradigm to work in. And a lot of these early socialist experiments didn't work because of that. But I think they do work on a local level. And I would say, look at churches as a good example. Not all churches do this, but I think they're a pretty good example. Like, every member of a church is expected to contribute a tithe. Some churches mandate this as part of their membership requirements. Others, it's just an expectation. Typically, it's 10%. And so those who earn more tend to give more out of pocket than those who don't. And then the church provides a social activities that everyone benefits in. They, maintain the space that people can congregate in. A lot of times, if you're a member of a church, you have access to those spaces. So they have a fellowship hall or gymnasium or whatever. You can use those spaces typically free of charge. And then a lot of times churches have welfare programs where if you hit hard times, you need help with something, the church is going to step in and help maybe cover a mortgage payment or cover some sort of bill, or they'll have members of the community who will step in and they'll provide meals if you're sick and that kind of thing. So at a local level, socialism does work. So don't think that, the idea of socialism in and of itself is the same thing as communism, and it doesn't work, because when you get people who voluntarily agree to that sort of arrangement, and it's in addition to their ability to own property, like members of a church aren't, unless you're a cult, but typically if you just are a member of a church, you're not going to forfeit your ability to go work and accrue wealth for yourself. You're going to supplement it with giving to the church and then receiving benefits from it. So it's complementary to capitalism, and socialism can work on a small scale because you don't have to accommodate all the disparate voices and opinions that would come in a federal system of socialism. Socialism can never work at scale in a country like the United States because you just have so many different needs and opinions and voices. And even though we are a federal country and we have our federal government and then we have the state governments, we're very regional in nature. Everyone has different needs, different requirements, right? Like, you can't expect someone in Maine to be paying for fire insurance for someone in California. In much the same way, you can't expect someone in North Dakota to be paying for hurricane damage for someone in, at a personal level for hurricane damage in Florida. And, we have issues with this now with our welfare state, and it's imbued socialism within what was originally espoused by our founders. And that's a whole separate critique, I think. Like, I think incorporating more welfare programs into the government and the original role of it is a problem in and of itself. And it shows why socialism doesn't work, because you have too many competing voices. But in and of itself, socialism isn't inherently bad. If it's done at a local level and people voluntarily agree to it, it can work. It can be a way for people to voluntarily redistribute their wealth to help other people. The problem is you have to get people who want to voluntarily do that. And there isn't really an incentive unless you're doing it out of generosity, right? And the church is a great example because of that. Unless you're doing it out of generosity and the goodness of your heart, you're going to have a hard time convincing big Z people with a lot of profit, to give their profit to low Z people who aren't, producing as much out of their productive capabilities. And it's extremely hard to convince these big Z people here to give to no Z people who are just parasites on the state. They're not contributing anything. And unfortunately, when you live in a socialist economy, you can't weed out the wheat from the chaff. You can't segment out the non-producers from the producers. Like, everyone kind of is in the same system. And so it creates a disincentive for people to work, and that's why it tends to fail. Okay, so because it failed, because socialism at scale didn't fail, and Karl Marx is over here talking about how you need to, violently overthrow those who have the Z, take these people, overthrow them, okay? Karl Marx observed, and I think a lot of the other implementers, Lenin, folks in Russia who successfully implemented communism, they observed that it doesn't, like, this here didn't work. So they needed an alternative. And so instead of having communal property, you still needed a strongman. You still need a strongman to enforce things, to get things done. You weren't going to get things done through communal property. So that's where the state comes in. So you have state-owned property, okay? So rather than you owning private property, you being allowed to determine how much Z you're producing, the state gets to decide. So the state decides, and then the state decides who it gets redistributed to. So the state becomes the final authority on how property is distributed and how property is gained and accrued, okay? And so I share all of this because I think it's important, because what all of this is about, why Mamdani got elected, is because of private property and the role of private property in our lives today. This is what it fundamentally comes down to. Like, yes, they're talking about rent freezes, they're talking about free grocery stores, free buses, all these nice things. That is just window dressing to the concept of private property, because throughout history, throughout the transition from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, private property has always been at the heart of it. And private property, and whether or not private property exists and how it's protected and who's responsible for protecting it, that shapes the government that you live in. So if you live in a country, a communist country, where the state owns the property and you don't own anything, it looks a lot like the strongman governments of feudal Europe. Just look at North Korea as a great example. Like, you have no freedom. So whatever you think in the Bill of Rights that's going to be protected, like that's gone. There's no First Amendment. You don't own any sort of weaponry to compete against the state. The state owns everything. State and property, by the way, people like don't realize this with communism. It's not just like factories, right? Like, it's not just the state is going to own like the means of production. That's what Karl Marx talked about. It's not just that, right? The state owns the inputs to the means of production, the state owns the means of production, and the state owns the outputs of the means of production. So if you want to take agricultural production as an example, the state owns your seeds, the state owns your fertilizer, the state owns your soil, the state owns your tools, your tractors, whatever, okay? The state owns the farms that you produce on. The state tells you how much to produce, how many hours to work, and gives you the number of bodies they think is required for you to work those fields. And then once you harvest your crops, the state owns the food and how it's transported and who gets it. Okay. So this is what happened in Russia and under the Soviet Union. And this is why this is so important to understand, because in both feudalism and communism, the people suffered. Like, you did not have the means to produce your own food. And that is how we got peasants leaving agricultural societies in Britain and across Europe during the Industrial Revolution and moving into cities, is because they didn't own the land, they didn't own the tools, they didn't own the means of producing their own food. So they had to go start selling their time for a wage so they could have money in order to go buy food. So the fact that we earn money, we work jobs and we earn money, that is an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution and the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. That is because we are so divorced from our own means of production that we no longer can produce food for ourselves. Capitalism, despite all its flaws, gave you the option to sell your labor to the highest bidder. So even if you were being exploited by your by whatever factory and management in that factory that you were working in, you could still hold a delta. You could still spend less than you earn. You could save the difference and you could invest it in the future. You could buy assets with it, buy property with it, reskill yourself, whatever. You could find another job. You had freedom to sell your skill on the market. And I know for in some periods of time, there was less freedom than others. I'm not saying it was absolute freedom. There were certainly periods of time, especially, you look here in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were a lot of reforms that had to take place because there was a lot of exploitation. So I'm not saying throughout this period of time, everyone had absolute freedom. Of course, there was periods of times where it was easier and harder depending on, the circumstances. But regardless, the system was set up so that you could sell your time for the highest wage possible, okay? Under communism, you don't have that option. You are told what to do. You are told how much you're going to earn, and everything is owned by the state. You don't own anything. So not only is there no private property rights, there's no freedoms that come with those rights. And because there's no freedom that comes with those rights, you have no means of moving yourself socioeconomically to improve your situation. So you're no better than a feudal serf in 14th century Europe. So I wanted to break this down because I think private property ownership is essential to understanding how and why Zohran Mamdani got elected, and it highlights where this country is going, specifically from the perspective of the Democratic Party. So let's dive into this map. So this is an interactive map that the New York Times put out that talks about how many people voted and some of the different aspects of the demographics of it. I do want to call attention real quick though to a similar map that The Guardian republished, but they published it with voting numbers. And you'll notice here, everyone is talking about how there was record turnout, right? There was 2 million people that voted on Tuesday and showed up in the elections, and this was a record. Keep in mind, New York City has a population of 8.5 million people. So the fact that only 2 million people showed up to vote in a city of 8.5 million is frankly deplorable. Brooklyn, you'll notice on the map, Brooklyn and the Bronx pretty much carried Mamdani, so very heavily so in Brooklyn. 658,000 votes were cast in Brooklyn. I think there's 2.5 million people who live there. So only a fraction, I think 20% of the voters actually voted. So that's important because we live in a system now where people, for whatever reason, maybe they can't vote, they're not of age, they have a felony. People, because of work, we don't give, time off for people to go vote. So, difficulty voting, whatever. There's myriad reasons why people don't vote. The fact of the matter is that people who are less burdened with responsibilities tend to vote more in elections because they have the ability to do so. So you tend to see these elections skew younger and older. So the people in the middle, the people who own property, typically, the ones who have equity in the future, they're not participating in the elections that shape the outcomes. shape the future. So I want to call that out because that is pretty the just sheer numbers is pretty important. But you'll notice here it breaks stuff down. So racial makeup, who won by past election, but call attention to median age. So the median age of younger voters, these are anyone under 45, skewed significantly higher for Mamdani, so about 30 points difference. And you'll notice all these people are largely congregated here in Queens and Brooklyn, which makes sense. If you've ever been to New York City, a lot of hipsters live in Brooklyn, and a lot of, that's where a lot of people live. And you'll notice that older voters tended to skew a little bit more for Cuomo. Not significantly so, but they tended to skew towards Cuomo. I would highlight, I guess I can do this. I don't like how they do the income on here because they only do below 50,000, which you're going to see mostly people in the Bronx, which makes sense. It's the poorest county, I think, in the United States in general. Bronx is heavily subsidized by welfare programs. Not a lot of people doing a lot there. And then above 200,000, unsurprisingly, they voted for Cuomo. But you don't really have the difference. Like 50,000 to 200,000 is a pretty big extreme. So you can just use the white space in this map, and that's kind of where everyone else is sitting. They're either more than 50,000 or less than 200,000. So your typical middle class. But I want to call your attention down here to housing type. Mostly renters. So Mamdani won overwhelmingly by 20 plus percentage points. And again, look at where renters predominantly live and look where they voted. So you have a lot of dark blue here in Brooklyn, and then of course here in the Bronx. Now consider where homeowners voted and where they live, okay? They live on Staten Island, they live in Queens. These are people who voted for Cuomo because these are the people who own property. Now, again, I would call your attention to rent. So considering that the vast majority of people who voted for Mamdani are renters, now let's look at the price of rent. So if you were below $2,000 per month, you voted for Cuomo. And again, I would suspect based on the overlay here with homeowners and rent below 2,000, this might be, they might have included mortgages here. I don't know if that is how the New York Times did this, but that would make sense. If you live on Staten Island and you bought your house in like 2007, you probably have a mortgage that is far below 2,000, okay? The next price point is median rent below 3,000, so 2 to 3,000. Again, you see people living on kind of the periphery, up in the Bronx. That kind of makes sense. But then it starts to get interesting. So you see a rent of $3,000 and above. These people voted for Mamdani by 21 point difference. Most of them live here in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. And then again, at the 4,000 level, you see them here in Queens and parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan as well. So why does that matter? One of the key selling points for Mamdani's campaign, one of the key promises was freezing rent. Okay, so he is catering to a group of predominantly young people. The vast majority, I think, of people, this is done by Tufts University, but from the 18 to 29 cohort, a lot more younger people voted than older people. But of the younger demographic, a lot of them voted for Mamdani. So 78% of young voters, 18 to 29, voted for Mamdani compared to just 50% of all voters in general. So you have young people who are renters who voted for Mamdani because he promised to freeze rent, and the vast majority of these people are renting at $3,000 and $4,000 a month. Now I know rent is expensive, specifically in Manhattan. Like obviously, I think we all know that, but I think what's surprising is Brooklyn, right? Because the average rent in Brooklyn is not actually that high. So if you go to the Furman Center at, I think this is from NYU, but you look at, this is all the demographic data. So you can go look at like renting and housing. So the median gross rent using 2024 dollars in Brooklyn is $1,800. So again, things have probably gone up because this isn't using 2025 data. So I'm sure, it's probably a little bit higher, but this is the median rent in Brooklyn, right? So this is far lower than the 3,000 to 4,000 that people are claiming here. So what does this tell me? And I say this as someone who used to live in Washington, D.C., someone who used to have this mindset of feeling entitled and deserving and worthy of living in a high cost of living area. I think that is what this is translating into. You have a group of young people, 18 to 29, who have been sold on a vision of what is expected of them in their lives, and that hasn't panned out. You know, the college to, or the career to college to career pipeline like didn't work out. People aren't able to afford rent. Wages have stagnated, all that kind of stuff. Okay, I get it. I've been there. Like millennials went through this too. The problem is that the housing that is being developed in a lot of these gentrified areas, which I would posit a lot of this this voting block is a highly gentrified area. A lot of that housing isn't necessarily being built to the demand of that area. It's just people are building all sorts of these luxury apartments, trying to maximize as much value from the real estate there as they can. And it makes sense. Like you have finite real estate, you got to get as much out of it as you can. Like multi-unit apartment complexes like make more per square foot than single family homes. Like that's why you're seeing a lot of those properties being built. But what this tells me here is if you are someone who fits into the 18 to 29 demographic, you are struggling and your rent is above $3,000 a month, that is telling me you're making a choice to live somewhere that you can't afford. And this is absolutely true, right? Like I'm here in Austin, right? Before my husband and I got married, I was living in an apartment downtown. It was a 2-bedroom apartment and it was $2,200 a month. Well, I can tell you right now, in other parts of Austin, especially as you get closer to the suburbs, you can find decent apartments for like $1,500. Some I've seen advertised for $1,000 because the housing is terrible. Like you can rent an entire house for $2,100. So I selfishly was renting an apartment that was valued at $2,200 because I wanted to live close to downtown. I had just moved here, and I wanted all of the cool amenities that came with the apartment. There's a whole separate video I could do about that because a lot of those amenities were kind of bullshit. But that's the point. It's like when you're young and naive, you want certain things out of your housing environment and you think you're entitled to certain things, and so you're more willing to pay a premium for it, and you don't understand the cost. So I think a lot of these people, if they're paying these price points when there are apartments available at lower price points, they're doing so out of choice, not out of necessity. And so they are asking the government, the local government there, and the taxpayers there to shoulder the burden of their own choices. But this obviously creates a huge problem now. So you have people who are renting a lot by choice in some regards. I would say a large portion of the population in New York, not necessarily the ones who are born and raised there, but the transplants who come and move there from outside the other places in the country, they are doing so by choice. They are forfeiting lower cost of living housing in other parts of the country in order to have the privilege of living in New York City. And that is the reality of it. I mean, I covered a piece in Substack several months ago, but it was talking about the arrested development of millennials living in Brooklyn in particular. But it interviewed a guy who was 38 years old. I think he said history in college, and he ran like a furniture store in Brooklyn, and he was complaining about how he would never be able to own a home in Brooklyn. Yet he had moved from a Philadelphia suburb in Pennsylvania. He had moved away from his family, went to New York, clearly by 38, like not in a relationship, not married, doesn't own a home, clearly like not working out to the point that he expected. But the homes in his community, that he grew up in are selling for $200,000. So yeah, you can lament not being able to afford like a multi-million-dollar brownstone in Park Slope, but that doesn't mean that affordable housing isn't available. It's just not available to you in that particular location. So people have to make a hard choice, right? Like you have to choose what you want. The problem with this is that you have people, like I said, who are imposing the consequences of their choices onto the municipal government, onto the electorate, and they are now going to demand free housing, cheap housing, rent subsidized housing, which is going to impact everyone, right? Like if you're a developer in New York City and you have to deal with frozen rent, like you're just not going to build. Like why waste your time, right? Like you're not going to build. So I think housing projects are going to decline. So rather than increasing the supply of affordable housing, it's going to decrease. But why this matters and why the whole rental aspect matters is because these people aren't property owners. These people have no equity in the places they live. They have no stake in the future. And because of that, they are able to vote along the lines of a system that rewards people who don't own property. Well, let's go back to the diagram I drew here. Which two groups of people don't own property? Socialists and communists. So this is why we're transitioning away from capitalism and into socialism and communism, because it is predicated on the loss of private property ownership. And so in order for socialism or communism to work, you have to surrender your right to property ownership. And if you are of a voting bloc who doesn't see yourself as ever owning property or having the ability to own property, you don't care. But the problem is this is going to adversely affect the rest of us. So I want to introduce you to my next stick figure diagram. So Zohran Mamdani didn't just become the mayor of New York. I think everyone's talking about this from the New York context, making memes about it. But you have to think a little bit bigger than this. This isn't just about New York. Zohran Mamdani just got a vote of confidence for a new direction in the Democratic Party, the way it's going. And even this morning, Bernie Sanders hijacked a press conference apparently that Chuck Schumer was hosting and said, like, Mamdani is the future of the Democratic Party. And even over the summer, this past year, Bernie Sanders took AOC under his wing and did an entire cross-country tour with her. So it's very clear that the direction that the Democratic Party is going in is not what we're accustomed to. It's going to be closer to this communist socialist trajectory. So just to give you an idea. So the current de facto head, if you will, of the the top person in the Democratic Party right now is Chuck Schumer. Okay. So Chuck Schumer, not doing pretty well in the polls right now. I think people are pretty tired of him. But he really doesn't have, he represents the old guard. He represents, a type of Democrat that has fallen to the wayside. The other, so he's in the Senate, and then obviously Nancy Pelosi is the other one. She is in the House, but she just announced today that she's going to be retiring. So Nancy Pelosi is about to be gone. Okay, so then other than that, who do you have? Well, the attempt by the establishment, so I would say Schumer and Pelosi represent the establishment, to anoint their successors. They attempted to anoint Kamala Harris, and they've attempted to anoint Hakeem Jeffries. Okay, so Kamala clearly didn't work out. Hakeem Jeffries, I'm going to be honest, I don't know a lot about him. I hear his name come up, but he doesn't really seem to be too significant of a power player. He's just kind of there in his current position, but not really doing anything. So that's kind of how I see it. You tell me if you observe it differently. But I want to call something to your attention. You'll notice 2 of these people come from New York. 2 of these people come from California. So 2 states in the entire country have basically shaped the Democratic Party and all of the policies that the rest of us have to live by. So when the Democrats are in power, they are being the Democratic leadership are the ones who are setting the agenda and what's priority and what they're going to pass. And so if the leadership of this establishment Democratic base is coming from New York and California, by virtue, the voters of those 2 states are effectively setting the agenda for the rest of us to follow. So if you have a communist who has been voted into power from the residents of New York, effectively, if he is the future of the Democratic Party, which I think he is, that means that New York and the people of New York are going to effectively set the standards that the rest of us are going to have to live by. Okay, so that's the establishment. So there have been some others who have come along the way to kind of challenge the establishment. So I think Bernie is the obvious one. Elizabeth Warren also came up. I think these guys would probably be your Occupy or your post-Occupy de facto leadership of the Democratic Party. So these were people who came up post-Occupy, maybe in response to Tea Party, definitely came out of the outgrowth of frustration from 2008 and the financial crisis. So they definitely were along the lines of definitely Bernie, socialist, but definitely along the lines of economic policies. And clearly because Bernie was not awarded the nomination in 2016, the establishment wasn't behind Bernie, right? So this has all been fringe. I would say I would add Fetterman from Pennsylvania to this list too. He's kind of an outsider who got elected, and I think he represents reasonable blue collar democratic values. If I could envision a traditional Democrat from like the 90s, I would put Fetterman. Like he would be it. But he's kind of on his own little island. He's been pretty much shunned by his party, so he's not making any headway. Okay, so that really leaves Bernie and the Elizabeth Warren camp to challenge the incumbents who are part of the establishment. Okay, so that's what's happening, and because the alternatives that Kamala or that Schumer and Pelosi, put out Kamala and Hakeem Jeffries, they haven't done anything well. There's a void. There's a void. So let me move these over because I think this will make more sense. So what do we have now? Okay, so we have two new anointed de facto leaders of the Democratic Party. You have two millennials, one AOC, the other Zohran Mamdani, both in their early 30s, both from New York, who are now the effective leaders of the Democratic Party. And this is the direction that they're going. So the fact that Mamdani won is a vote of confidence for the trajectory that Bernie started. But it's a more radicalized version of it, right? So it's seeing his socialist vision implemented through the Democratic Party. So he's now seeing Zohran Mamdani being able to do what he could not do when these folks were in power, right? Like Bernie could not alone beat Schumer and Pelosi, especially in 2016. But now that, we have Trump derangement syndrome captivating the Democrats and obviously a terrible economy, and you have all these people in New York wanting free rent, the environment is now primed for a Mamdani type person to take over. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, AOC, she has outgrown her position in the House of Representatives. So she is either going to run for the Senate or she's going to run for office for the presidency in 2028. The Democrats need a strong leader. There is a benefit to trying to run a woman again, especially someone like AOC, who has a lot of charisma and a lot of appeal to younger voters. And I think if JD Vance is the nominee for the Republicans, then that means you're going to have two millennials going at each other. So I think to get the younger vote, because clearly that's who's showing up now to vote, you're going to need to have someone of their generation in play in order to get them to show up and get them to rally behind. Mamdani has created the playbook for that to happen. So I think it's very easily possible that AOC will replicate that in 2028, and we will see a mass movement, kind of similar to what we saw in 2008 with Obama, but in favor of AOC. So why is this all important? Because Mamdani is a communist. He's not a socialist. He has socialist ideals and the idea of communal ownership, but it's not communal in nature. It's state provided. And he's explicitly said that he's going to have government-run, municipal-run grocery stores. The government is going to impose rent freezes. The government is going to be the one to provide free busing. And he said in his victory speech, there's no issue that's too big or too small for the government to care about. Okay, so Mamdani may be on paper a socialist, a democratic socialist, but in practice, because this doesn't work, the only way for him to implement his policy vision is to implement communism, okay? And so if he is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party, that means his policies are now AOC's policies. So if AOC runs for the presidency in 2028 and wins, she will also have the same mandate that Zohran Mamdani currently has to run a communist state-run government. So this is the direction we're heading in. It's not just that he won the mayoral race in New York. It's that this is gone, okay? This establishment is gone, and this is the future. And the future is not a future of private property ownership. It's not a future where you, as a average Joe Schmo, can go work a job, save your money, buy a house, start a business, do whatever with it. There's no freedom now to do that. So long as this exists, his platform exists, your freedoms to do what you want have now fallen by the wayside, okay? But because New York is such an important power player and big Democrat nationwide federal elections and politics, whatever policies are implemented here, the Democrats across the country are also going to start implementing in their own jurisdictions. And that is going to become the platform of the party moving forward. So I think it's really important to pay attention to what is happening in New York City right now. Like, yes, like people are talking about him invoking like Sharia law and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, there's separate conversations to be had about that. But I would say don't lose sight of the long game that's being played here. Like, this is fundamentally about redistributing wealth. And I'm not saying redistributing, like, we're not talking about taking from Elon Musk and giving to the poor. This isn't like Robin Hood redistribution of wealth. This is saying, okay, if you make $250,000, that's too much. We're going to take from you and we're going to give to these welfare queens over here in the Bronx who aren't working at all, who aren't productive members of society, who, if anything, are parasitic and just take. And we're seeing evidence of this with the SNAP shutdown and the government shutdown, right? Like, we've seen throughout the year, starting with Doge onto SNAP now, like, there is rampant abuse within the welfare state where people take and they're not producing anything from it. Okay, so it's stagnating the economy and it's disincentivizing, frankly, workers to work. Like, why would you work? Why work? Like, why strive to make, 6 figures or more if you're just going to be taxed at 40-50%, you know? Like, you have more of an incentive to make yourself poor. So this is going to be what happens, right? And people are going to leave New York, I think. They're going to move to other states. You know, Texas has been a large recipient of residents from California and states like New York over recent years. So I can see people coming here. But I think this is worth paying attention to. You're going to see internal migration within the United States as people start seeing how this is happening. And they're going to move to states that can still guarantee property rights, because there's also, the separate issue right now of the federal versus local implementation of the rule of law. You're seeing this with ICE not being able to enforce law enforcement activities. And so people are going to start moving to places where private property rights are protected. It's not even just like how much you're being taxed, it's your ability to own property, because it starts at taxing the rich, right? Like that's the easy thing. It's like, okay, we're going to take from the billionaires, we're going to give to you, make your housing free. Okay. Well, at some point that's going to not work. Okay. So then they're going to have to take from someone else, and they're going to have to keep taking and taking and taking. And so the only thing that's left is for the government to run everything. So keep an eye on what's happening in New York. It's not just confined to New York. This is going to have significant impact and implications for the rest of the country, especially the Democratic side of the aisle. The Democratic Party is now a communist party. There is no other way to square it. So moving forward, I think this is what we're up against. It's not even just people you disagree with on whatever, pick your issue of the day. Fundamentally, this is about, do we have the right to own property in this country? And is the role of government in this country to protect our right to own property, or to take our property and redistribute it to everyone else? I mean, that's what's at stake now. So let me know what you think about this, if you've been following this at all. If you have any thoughts, I would be curious to hear some of your perspectives on this. Thank you so much for watching. That's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this analysis of my lovely stick figures, I would love it if you would like and subscribe. And I will see you in the next video.